All right. So let me introduce the framework. Um, so I don't know, like a nerdy business school professor, I feel the need to give an acronym to my framework. So I have given it an acronym, um, which my framework for evaluating projects is called pain points. That's a very, very common buzzword used in entrepreneurship um, used in entrepreneurship circles to try to identify opportunities. Look for pain points in important target customer bases. And if you build something really good that solves that and the market realizes it, then you may have a winner. So that's why I built an acronym around those words. But let me tell you what each letter in the acronym represents. Okay. So first of all, there's two words, and the two words hit on two categories that I think characterize important dimensions of a project. One is about the overall macro opportunity, which you can think of like as being like how much value gets created in society by the thing you're generally trying to be a part of, right? So it's kind of like market size, loosely speaking. So far, so good. And then the second word, right? So pain is going to be about the macro opportunity, and points is going to be letters telling us key questions in the micro opportunity, which is not about the size of the pie, the macro pie, but like more about what percentage of the pie can you get and what are things that could influence the percentage of the pie that you get, right? So more micro elements of that opportunity. And so I'm going to try to split across those two themes, the macro and the micro, some of the most important questions that as an investor in a startup, I would want to have clarity on. Okay. And again, just to reiterate, I do not view this as a checklist. So it is not my goal to find something that looks amazing on all those dimensions. But I do want to know for any given opportunity, on which of these dimensions does it look good, and on which of these dimensions does it look bad? So far, so good? All right, perfect. So let's start with a macro opportunity. So the P in pain stands for problem. Talk to any entrepreneur, and the thing that they have initial dead focus on is what problem are they trying to solve, right? What pain point or problem is being addressed by this startup? You also want to ask, and maybe you could call this a founder question as opposed to a project question. I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. But once I understand the problem that a startup is addressing, I ask myself a question like, does the founding team have like a deep understanding or a unique insight into this problem? Are they just kind of presenting me a problem and I'm like, look, they're trying to do it, but I could pick anyone smart off of the street and I would think they'd be able to solve the problem just as well as these folks? That's the case, like the problem, maybe, not sure this specific opportunity is the best way to tackle this problem, right? Again, you might call this founding team, which is perfectly fine. So maybe it's part of the second framework. But you really want to have a concrete understanding of this problem, right? And then the question becomes, well, how attractive is this problem, right? And that means kind of two things, like at the individual customer level, how deep is the pain? Are you solving a little problem for people, or are you solving like a really big one? In general, you want that the customer pain be pretty sharp, right? But in addition to that, you want to get a sense of the whole market, not just the individual customer. So size of the market matters. Again, I'm saying this. I mean, you're probably like, okay, thank you. I mean, I never ever thought that this was something that was relevant. Obviously not. It's obvious, right? But here's something that actually is a little bit less obvious to people, right? Which is when I talk about the size of the market, like if someone comes and says, well, I'm making a new toothbrush, and I kind of like, I went to like some government website that told me there's like 7 billion people in the world. of which half of them own a toothbrush, or like, well, hopefully more than half. 80% own the toothbrush, 80% of, that's 5.6 billion. They buy toothbrush once every 2 months. It's $2, 6 times a year, $12. Oh, this is like a $60 billion opportunity. If I only get 1% of that, I'm like 600 million. That's like well over the definition of a startup, 100 million in revenue. Like, you got to go for this. Like, that's not what I mean by size of the opportunity. That's just donkey shit. Okay. Like, that's not the way you want to think about it. It's nice to get a sense of how big a potential market could be, and that it have, you know, a B in the in its kind of shortening way of writing. But actually, you want a little bit more clarity than that, because there's no way a startup can tackle multi-billion dollar market all at once right away. That just doesn't happen, right? Because, you know, there's a bit of a David and Goliath with those markets. Goliath is already doing that. If you try to do it like Goliath as David, you are screwed. It's not going to happen. And so generally, instead, when you're thinking about the attractiveness of the opportunity, you want to think of it both strategically. What is the overall size of the market actually? Yeah, knowing that potential is good, but you also want to think about it tactically, because there's no way you can like immediately, you know, beat Goliath, right? So by tactically, what I mean is usually what you want to do is look at a market and chop it into sub pieces, segment that market. And then you want to say to yourself, well, which segment of the market could I tackle first and actually potentially beat Goliath there? So there should be like also a sense often of sequencing, right? Which segment of the market am I going to tackle first? Can that be tackled and acquired? Can it be preserved? And can succeeding in this catapult me to expanding progressively the size of my market, so that, yeah, maybe eventually I am selling toothbrushes to everyone in the world, but I can't go straight to that. If I try to go straight to that, I just seem overwhelmingly naive. See what I'm saying? If you want an example, like, right, so I call this like being tactical, right? Thinking like, okay, look, I would like to get here, but how am I going to like build myself into that? If you want a great example of like amazing tactical expansion of a market like that, look at Facebook, right? What did Facebook tactically do? Step 1, Harvard. Dominate Harvard. Step 2, go to other universities that are a little bit like Harvard, where people have like friends in those universities, and then go and try to dominate that, because the fact that you've got Harvard helps you get Stanford, or helps you get Brown, or helps you get Princeton, and then go dominate that. And then once you get that, start to expand to all universities, right? And once you have all universities, well, there are people who are just before entering university that would kind of like to be socially connected to people in universities. There are people who recently graduated who would also like to be connected because they intersected in college. And then once you have enough density there, even mommy and daddy want to join, right? So there's something pretty brilliant and tactical with how they approach this. And they were very, very deliberate in where they would expand next. They didn't try to go to the whole world right away. They just tactically put themselves in a position where they eventually kind of, you know, approximately got there, right? But there was a brilliance to the sequencing, right? So when I want to understand the attractiveness of what's being done, I want to see like what's the potential size. I want to know what you're going for first, and I want to see, is there some tactiques that are about going from small to big, and what the intermediate steps might look like. By the way, for those of you who have watched the video that's in the slide after the Jim Guts video, which is the Peter Thiel video, he talks about two things, one of which is exactly what I just said. The start small and, you know, progressively conquer all. That's one of the things he emphasizes. So clearly he thinks that's important. And you know what? If Peter Thiel thinks it's important, I'm willing to buy it. You know, it's the guy's brilliant. I mean, listen to his interviews. The guy is smart. There's like so much clarity in the way he explains things, right? You can tell his brain works differently than most human beings. Very kind of first principles thinking. Anywho,
Jiro.
go ahead.
So when I completely understand both what Peter Thiel was saying and what you just kind of echoed as well. But I was wondering is, do startups typically try and go, if you take the Facebook example of like getting Harvard, then going to Stanford, like call them all else equal, relatively equal size, segments of the market. Can startups jump in size so they grab Harvard and all of a sudden they go get, 3 universities instead of 1? Like,
of course, of course. I mean, and the answer is yes. I mean, look, and there's more tactical richness in what Facebook did than what I just described. Let me just give you one example, just to give you guys a sense of like, it's not purely formulaic. There's like, you need to be making judgment calls, and some of these things get unanticipated. Here's one tactical thing that Facebook did. Because you know what? Once Facebook is getting traction in all these universities, it perhaps might not surprise you that other like startups try to launch social networks at other universities, right? So like, oh wow, you hear that like Facebook is expanding universities, but they haven't come to Houston yet, right? And so someone at Rice University launches the Rice University Facebook, right? Starts doing well. So like Facebook learns about it. What does Facebook do next? Facebook is like, we got to go to Rice, and we got more money than Ricebook, and so what we'll do is we won't just launch at Rice. We're going to launch at Rice, University of Houston. Those are the only 2 universities I know in Houston. There's probably a few others, Houston State and Texas, University of Texas at Houston. Anyway, I don't even know if those things exist. But they launch at all the local universities, because if I'm choosing between Ricebook and Facebook, and Facebook offers me an easy way to connect with people from University of Houston as well, I mean, that's a value prop that Ricebook can't provide, right? So they did things like that, and that would require them to launch at more than one place at a time, right? So yeah, look, tactical. So the thing with tactical is that you tend to be very crafty and idiosyncratic in what you're doing there. And so almost with the tactical stuff, if I'm trying to assess whether a project has a good tactical potential, I almost want to understand, like, how are you reasoning through your tactiques? Because if you can explain to me your tactiques with a lot of clarity, I feel more confident that you can adjust tactiques as needed than if you're just like taking a playbook that you read, on, or you heard on a podcast. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I mean, the answer is it's always it's always nuanced, and it's almost never one size fits all. That's basically maybe the way I would say it. Okay. So far, so good. So far we've focused on the problem, and we've focused on maybe what the magnitude of the problem might be in both an overall size and a sequential size. Look, you also need to look at what solution the startup is proposing, right? Because I might have a great problem. If I offer a terrible solution, it's basically, if I give money, it's just a dumpster fire or something like that, right? So initial solution matters. And you want to think about how the initial solution that's being proposed differs from what other solutions exist in the marketplace. It better not be that you're like, this, I'm pretty sure this is already done by XYZ. Like, if that's your answer, I'm not sure I want to be betting in this. So you really want to understand, how does this solution differentiate itself from other options in the market? And why is that differentiation so important and core to the problem that's described? There should be a lot of clarity around that. Here's another thing that matters for the macro opportunity. and that's the last letter in pain, N, and that stands for now. It's really about timing. What makes now the right time to solve this problem? Because there's a lot of like startup ideas that that get pitched to investors where an investor can justifiably ask themselves, like, wait a second, like this is a pretty obvious problem. The technology you're using to solve this problem has been around for a decade. Like, it's not a subtle problem, so it was probably someone tried before. Like, you're not the first Einstein to come up with this obvious idea, right? And if that's the case, why now? Like, if you can't answer that question on something where the problem's been obvious for a while, the solution has been feasible for a while, it's probably been tried before and it failed, and that probably says something about the potential of this time, right? And by the way, this is something that startup founders underestimate the importance of all the time. I view it as one of the most important questions, the why now? Why now? Why is now the right time to do it? Why couldn't we have done it 5 years ago? Especially true if the problem is already kind of known. And I kind of look for triggers, right? Like, has technology changed so that the solution couldn't have been done before? Or have demographics changed or cultural things changed that mean that people like feel that problem a lot more now than they used to? Has regulation changed, which now allows us to do this? Or has regulation changed and the regulation has created the problem? All of those things. These are kind of potential candidates to the why now question. But if I'm not convinced after you pitch to me that this is a special time to be trying this, I myself am not going to invest. I'm not rich enough to throw my money around. Okay. And I actually think, the VCs that have access to the best opportunities are also going to not invest. So far, so good. So, I view this as 4 really, really core questions to ask about a project. But they're really macro questions. Now I want to go to the micro questions because there's also more detailed nitty-gritty questions that are relevant to ask about a project that aren't picked up by these big macro things. And hopefully, as we describe the questions, it'll make sense that they matter, right? So now we get to that second word in our framework, which is points. And the P in points is for protection. Barriers to entry in the business. We already discussed this in our very first lecture, that a defining characteristic of a startup, well, at least a startup that's worth investing in, is that it needs to be able to protect its turf if it starts winning. Because it loses so much money early on, the only way to justify an investment is to get a lot of goodies down the road to offset those losses. You can only do that if you're able to protect your turf, if you are able to erect barriers to competition. And so we'll want to think about the types of barriers to competition that exist and think about, a given project. Does it at least, chime well on one or a few of those barriers? Someone had a question, sorry?
Yeah, it's Kanish.
Yeah,
and my question is, I understand that that startups need to have high barriers to entry, but do you see, or do you think it would ever be possible where the first mover advantage in a certain space would overcome the need for high barriers to entry? So like somewhere where it just makes, like, if someone has the initial idea, so many people would go towards that company, and then it's very hard for another company coming in to capture market share.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a question of lingo. When I say barrier to entry, what you just described is a barrier to entry, right? I mean, I don't view it, I don't see a distinction between barrier to entry, barrier to competition, right? So, so this we're just arguing over terminology here. What you just said falls into what I call protection, right? Maybe it would be one manifestation of what you just said would be like brand value. By being the first to enter, you establish the strong brand before other people, and that gives you pricing power over others, right? That would be an example of protection.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, it's good to ask those questions because, like, you know, people think of words slightly differently, right? So we do want to make sure that we're thinking about the same stuff. I'm being broad here with the notion of protection. Anything that allows you to secure profits and like, you know, not have to reduce your profits too much because other people try to do the same thing you're doing or something similar, or try to disrupt you. Anything that's effective for doing that is part of protection, right? I don't mean one little narrow thing here. It's a broad concept that's super important. A broad concept that's super important. Kanish, do you want to mute your thing? Because I think I'm hearing myself back kind of like a screeching tiger or something. I don't know what that is.
So sorry about that. Sorry.
That's okay. I hope that's not what I sound like. But in any case, yeah, go ahead.
So all these, you know, barriers to entry have to be idiosyncratic. There can't be any macro barriers to entry. Like, you're not going to find a startup that has somehow they've exploited some large scale barrier that, you know, prevents.
Oh, of course. When I look, I mean, again, maybe this is just, again, this right now we're just talking about limits of the English language, right? Or any language. You know, when I'm saying micro, I don't mean it's like the super granular micro. It's just, you know, it's micro in the sense that macro is the size of the pie. Micro is what piece of the pie do you get? But it could be a macro factor that leads to that slice of the pie. So yeah, sorry, maybe the word macro and micro is, you know, getting people twisted up a little bit, but anything that allows you to secure your piece of the pie for the long term is protection. Even if it's something that's because of a broad government regulation or stuff like that. Okay? So that's protection, right? What is the second letter in the acronym? O. O stands for other competition. Because you don't want to just think about what the barriers are, because the strengths of the barriers will kind of also depend on whether there are other people doing the same thing you're trying to do right now, and whether there's some folks just about to start entering. If you know no one else is coming in for 2 years, you feel a lot safer than if like someone else came in a year ago, or someone is literally just about to come in next week. Right? So understanding both the current and trying to get a feel for what the soon to be emerging future competitors are is very important here as well. And here's another question to ask yourself about you vis-a-vis other competitors. What's your edge? Like, why are you better than them? We should have some clarity around that. Again, that's part team, but it's not just team. The next two letters are really just one thing. This is what you do when you're working with an acronym, is you start kind of twisting things around a little bit. But the IN in points is income statements. And I'm using this term liberally because it's not actually the income statement. It's about how can the solution be monetized, some sense of the forecast of financials, and early on with a startup especially, the forecast of the costs are honestly more important than the forecast of the revenues, because the forecast of the revenues are almost always, you know, mystical numbers that don't necessarily translate to reality. The revenue numbers are like this oftentimes early on for a startup. Everyone has this hockey stick curve that's starting tomorrow, right? But like that doesn't happen very often. But we care a lot as an investor about your handle on costs, because you need to have a handle on costs to know how much you need to raise. You don't want to raise too much and over dilute yourself, right? And so if you have a good handle of costs, I've got more faith in your venture, because you need to have it to be able to navigate something on the lean. which is what startups really try to do, ideally. Things like unit economics, which I discussed in a Blackboard session in a video. Unit economics, if they're available, are relevant here as well. That's a little bit more later stage. So for the early stage, unit economics usually isn't available. Sound good? And next point is the T, the letter T. It's the team. And what I'm basically saying here is any framework that someone says, even when they talk about a project, they're still going to be talking about the team. So you can't escape the team ever. It's just sometimes you put very little weight on the project, and I'll talk about that later. But the things that we pay attention to, I've got my next framework, so I'll just zip through this super quick. I'll talk about it in way more detail in a few slides. But with respect to team, we've got passion, perseverance, some dimension of excellence. It could be technical, but it could be something else. Self-awareness, eagerness to learn, ability to adapt, ability to communicate your vision and motivate other people. These are all things that matter about the team. And when you're thinking about the team, you don't just think about one founder. You want to think about the entire founding team and how well they fit together. And again, we'll talk more about what that means when we talk about our founder framework. And then another thing that I care a lot about in the microeconomics of the project is I want to try to think about all the things that can go wrong, right? What can go wrong with this project? Under what scenarios would shit hit the fan here, right? And that's the last letter S. It's the stumbling blocks, right? What could lead the startup to stumble? So what are its important risks and hurdles? These could be regulatory. This could be about trying to create a market that doesn't even exist yet and how difficult that is. I try to think about all those things. It could be about the state of the economy changing, right? We're probably thinking a lot about stuff like that during our period right now because there's so much uncertainty as to what's going to be happening over the next year, 2 years, and even longer, right? So thinking about how does this startup get impacted in different versions of how bad our current environment becomes is probably something we think about. And when we think about stumbling blocks, it's not just list out the stumbling blocks. You want to map out the idea maze around this a little bit more. And in particular, you identify the different stumbling blocks and you want to ask yourself, can I mitigate this stumbling block ex ante before the fact? So that if the stumbling block happens, what I did before it happened minimized the damage. I also want to ask, is there a way for me to detect quickly whether a stumbling block actually happens? Another thing I might want to ask is, if this stumbling block occurs, what should I do next? Right? So you want to think about how you do things and what happens to the value of the investment, right, when different things that would be problematic materialize, even if they haven't materialized yet. Sound good? So these are the questions I ask. I'm just right now going to summarize super high level.
I had a quick, sorry.
Go ahead, Carolyn.
I had a quick question about for the last slide, if you want to just go back. For the why now question. Mm-hmm. What happens if the startup is just solving a novel, like a problem, they just have a novel solution? Like there isn't a particular reason as to why it hasn't been previously been addressed.
So that's a good question, right? Like remember this is a good question. Let me tell you why it's a good question, because it actually gives us a little bit of a window into prioritizing or weighing this framework, right? So what Carolyn has just identified is, not via real world example, but via logical argument. Carolyn has identified a scenario where maybe you would put less weight on the now, which is you're solving a known problem, right? But you're providing a novel solution. And even though that novel solution could have been provided before, we can document that it was never provided. Well, that's something we can do some due diligence on, right? we can actually go look at the history of this market and the history of service or product provision around this problem and actually check whether this has really never been done before. Is it really that creative? If it is very creative, then come on. I mean, logically, it makes sense. Maybe we should be a little bit less worried about this, right? But most of the time, people say they have a novel solution, and that's complete bullshit, right? So, like, you need to do due diligence around a claim like that, right? Because the reason why a lot of novel, like self-proclaimed novel solutions aren't novel is because none of us know every solution that's out there. And so we might have actually independently reinvented the wheel. It doesn't mean that, you know, so like good on us, we were creative, says something about our brain power. But unfortunately, some other human also had that idea like a few thousand years ago. So yeah, like novelty, you do a ton of due diligence around, right? And that's really about the other competitors and about the differ from existing solutions. When you look for existing solutions, you don't just look at like, who are the 3 biggest players in the market right now? You got to do more digging than that. Sound good? But it's a very good question because it actually, it gives me this opportunity to preview a little bit about the not one size fits all, not a checklist. Because you illustrated a setting that if that novelty claim is true, we don't need to care as much about this. Even though most of the time we care a lot about it. Not one size fits all. That's why weighing the frameworks is such a nuanced problem. Got it? Okay. So I'm just going to rifle through some of these things. I'm just going to high level tell you guys about these videos, mainly to encourage you guys to view the videos someday, because I view the videos as providing support to what I've told you about these frameworks, that these are things real world VCs think about. So Jim Gutz talks about the framework that Sequoia uses. Sequoia is the single most famous VC firm in the history of planet Earth. First VC investor, or tied for first VC investor in Apple. They were investor in Yahoo. They were investor in WhatsApp. The number of multi-billion-dollar exits that they have, you know, been the first, or at least super early investor in, is just remarkable. Remarkable. It's one of the venture funds that I pay very close attention to.
Jiro?
Yep.
I have a question in terms of what you just said about Sequoia. Do you think, is it like a causation or correlation type of thing where because Sequoia invests in these companies, they become successful? Or is it just Sequoia has the ability to identify good companies and that's where their core competency is? Or is it like a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both. And there's a bit of a flywheel effect here, right? You know, by establishing a track record of being a successful investor, you know, it makes founders, the best founders, want to work with them, which then makes it easier for them to have success in the future, right? So, you know, Sequoia is one of the lucky VCs where like every most promising startup is going to go to them. Now, they don't always win on an offer because some other folks are going to outbid them. And of course, sometimes they make mistakes. Every investor makes mistakes. But it's both. It's both. And once you start doing really good in one, you basically get a magnet of success in the other, which then makes it even easier for you to have success in what you were already good at.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem. So anyway, this is a short video. Jim Gutz, best known. He actually recently, I think, retired from Sequoia, but he's best known as being the reason Sequoia invested in WhatsApp. Okay. He had to work hard to get WhatsApp to accept Sequoia money. Interestingly enough, WhatsApp never actually spent any of the Sequoia money and just got acquired by Facebook. And if you know anything about the acquisition, it was like an 18 or $19 billion investment. Acquisition. That's a huge exit, especially for a not IPO exit. I think the total that had been invested in WhatsApp was less than 50 million. Think of that for about 30% of the company. So 50 million became 30% of 19 billion. Not bad. So he talks about some of the things that he pays attention to when he's assessing a project. And if you write down the list of what he says, what you will see is that what he says is a subset of what I've said here. Everything that he says fits into one of the things I said, but there are things I said that he's not mentioning, which goes to the idea I'm trying to be comprehensive here and picking on the things that if you look at all most respected investors together, those are the things they look at combined, but any given investor might focus on just some subparts of it. Partially because different VCs specialize in investing in different types of startups. And because it's not one size fits all, you prioritize different things. So far, so good? Actually, if anyone wants to do it, I think it's a good exercise. Lay down what he says, map it into my framework. If you do that and send it to me, I will send you an email back telling you what I think about the way you categorized it. I am promising to do it, okay? Because I think it's actually a valuable learning exercise. Peter Thiel, it's a longer video that talks about even fewer things, but he's a very good talker. Jim, a man of small number of words, man of several words. But he emphasizes two things in my framework. Right. One is the starting small thing, which is really about the tactics around exploiting the attractiveness of a market. And then the other one is barriers to competition, which is about protection and other competitors. So far, so good? And actually, I wrote down in words the key quotes from his video. So these are things that he actually says word for word in that presentation. And by the way, in that presentation, he gives you like an 80-20 on a very famous book that he wrote, which is 0 to 1. It is a hugely impactful book on big picture philosophy around what drives the most important startups. Because Peter likes to distinguish between startups that create a new market so that you go from 0 participants in the market to 1 participant versus those that just go and make additive, incremental improvements to market. In other words, you go from 1 in the market to 2 to 3 to 4. He's like 1 to N is less interesting. That's not where the biggest returns lie. It's really in the 0 to 1. And in the 0 to 1, these two things are so important. I think I've given you guys like the 1-minute summary of his book now. But read the book. It's actually an easy read. So now what I want to do is I want to give you guys a bit of a quote from another famous VC. Everyone here is like among the most respected VCs in the world, right? So that if you don't believe me when I tell you the framework, maybe you have comfort in the fact that these are things that real people do, not all alone in Bronfman people do. Quote here, Mark Andreessen, we have quoted him before. And this is what he says about something he dwells a lot on when he's thinking about assessing a startup. So he says, look, we want to hear a comprehensive rundown of the competition, including their positive attributes. So you don't just dump shit on your competitors. This shows the entrepreneur is engaged with reality and isn't living in her own private Idaho. I don't know. I guess that sounds like it's not a good thing. Where there are no competitors and or the competitors all suck. Because that does seem like a pretty naive thing to try to say. Then we want to hear how your company's offering is better, different than the competition, ideally in ways that can be verified in due diligence, technical examination, customer reference calls, etc. My personal opinion is that startups should focus on being different rather than being better. So your goal isn't to say, I've got a product that is better than the competitor in every single way. If your competitor is a Goliath and you're a very poor David, it's kind of difficult to believe that your product is going to be better in every single way. So instead, you try to be worse in several ways, but better in those few ways that the other Goliath is not paying attention to, that allow you to go and capture the imagination of some segment of that start small market. See what I'm saying? Or not what I'm saying, what Mark Andreessen is saying. Your product doesn't have to be better than the competitors in all cases, as long as it's different. And in being different, appeals to part of the market that the competition is not as well suited for. Very few startups can bring a product to market that is truly better than the competitors across all the dimensions that the customers care about. It's almost always a red flag when someone asserts that they have no competition. From an investor standpoint, good markets naturally draw competition. And so if there is no competition, that often means that the company is in a terrible market, right? But every once in a while, there is a company that has a genuinely new idea and therefore no competition. Alas, those entrepreneurs usually have a hard time convincing investors to invest. It takes a visionary investor to invest in a 0 to 1, right? I mean, if you look at the most famous 0 to 1 investments in VC over the last 20 years, every single one of them got rejected by many, many famous VCs. If you want to, for shits and giggles, right? If you want to do the following, there's a very famous venture firm called Bessemer Venture Partners. Go to their website and try to find a link on their website called the Anti-Portfolio. The Anti-Portfolio, they talk about all the home runs that tried to take their money and where they said no, sometimes in pretty outrageous ways. They basically decided they weren't interested in investing in Google. They weren't interested in investing in Facebook. They weren't interested in investing in Apple. There's more, right? So, and you have to understand, the fact that they're willing to admit this tells you how well respected they are. By the way, they were the first investor in Shopify, right? And that's not their first success. They were already famous before they ever did that. They're not a Canadian VC; they're a Bay Area VC. But like, it just shows you, like, it's the 0 to 1 stuff. It's tough. Like, you're getting it wrong more often than you're right, even if you're a genius, right? But if you can just shift the percentage to getting it right by a little bit, then you're, because the home runs are such high contributors to value, you get yourself a good return. In baseball lingo, getting a few more home runs like pops up your slugging percentage by quite a bit. So yeah, this is what Mark Andreessen has to say. And it really just highlights that you really want to think about this question of, like, how are you different? And are you different in a way that matters and that highlights the weakness of the incumbent? I'm not going to talk much about this here, but there's like visual strategies that startups almost always use to try to highlight this different and good thing. And the terminology that's actually given for this is called a Moore positioning diagram. That's named after Geoffrey Moore, whom you guys might remember is the person who wrote Crossing the Chasm. Okay? So he's also known for popularizing a simplification of how you try to convey to yourself as a founder and to your investors how you might be different and good, right? And it's about focusing on key differentiation and key benefit. This is just a little dinky picture from a book that another book that Geoffrey Moore wrote. Oh no, it might actually just be a chapter in a book. If anyone's interested, I can probably dig up the chapter on my computer and share it with you. It's like 12 pages long, if I recall. But just to prove to you guys that people think about this, as startups. This is a more positioning diagram that was in the Airbnb pitch. This is a more positioning diagram that was in the LinkedIn pitch. I could find many more examples, but I just wanted to leave it at 2. Again, I'm not giving you guys the full flavor of more positioning because I don't have the time, but it's really just about tackling and conveying what Mark Andreessen said he cares a lot about. How are you different and good? And going back to my framework, it's not my framework, it's my borrowed synthesis of other people's frameworks. Right? Initial solution, how does it differ from existing solutions in good ways? Okay? This says not covered in class, so I will not cover it in class. It's just a simple nerdy model that highlights just how important it is to protect your turf in the long run. If you like looking at math, you can play around with it. It's not that important because I think intuitively we all understand that that claim is true. The thing that people often underestimate is just how important the ability to protect turf is. We're talking a small change in ability to protect turf can easily lead to like a plus minus 75 to 90% swing in value. So not small potatoes. I think potatoes are from Idaho sometimes, right? Anyway, I'm not sure. So far, so good. I have some slides in my notes that discuss the different types of barriers to competition that exist. Okay. I actually lay them out in a reasonable amount of detail, right? So I distinguish between natural and manufactured barriers to entry. Natural is something that's kind of natural to the market. It's either there or it's not. It's not something that like the startup itself, has a lot of control over. Things like network effects, marketplace effects, economies of scale as well, high setup and development costs. Those are things that are either there or not there. And so you want to find out in your market, is some combination of those things there? I think you guys, we've already talked about network and marketplace effects before, so I don't feel the need to rehash. And I think you know economies of scale and high setup development costs. But there's also manufactured barriers to competition. Some examples are intellectual property protection. When you have a patent that truly prohibits other people from doing what you do, I think we can agree that makes it tough for other people to compete against you, right? Then that's obviously manufactured because it's a legal device, right? The only thing I'll say is sometimes people overestimate the value of intellectual property protection or patents. Because look, if you have a patent in biotech, that's a pretty strong barrier to competition. Because stuff in biotech or in pharma, like whether a drug works, it only works in the exact conditions that you figured out. So that if someone else changes something, it's going to totally stop working. Right? So in biotech pharma, IP is super strong. But in software, IP is not super strong. Because, okay, fine, you came up with an algorithm that does X. Someone else can write a different algorithm that also roughly does X. So even though you have IP, you can't sue them because you have IP around your code most of the time. And the patent office is going to narrow the scope of how broadly you can apply that so that people can circumvent your patent. So you want to know that in your industry, are IP protection strong or are they weak, i.e. can they be circumvented? But when they're strong, it's a nice manufactured barrier to competition. There's also switching costs, right? Switching costs makes it less likely that a competitor comes in and you lose the customers you've already got. So anything you do that makes it difficult for your customer to leave you can act as a strategic barrier to competition. Let me give you an example, right? I use a product, and in the process of using the product, I create data that's useful for me for making actionable insights. And the provider that I use, they store my data in the cloud, and they make it very difficult for me to pull out the data and bring it to another platform. Maybe when I ask for the data, they send it to me in a really funky, like, data format that is like not usable by the others. Well, that creates a switching cost, right? So you might want to think about that. I mean, it sounds a little bit sketchy, but you do what you do to maximize value, right? Can you do something in product design that makes it more difficult for your customers to leave you once they've been, using you for a long time? There's a bunch of clever things that startups do to try to create that switching cost, by the way. I don't have time to go over details there, but if anyone is ever interested, I'm happy to chat about many examples there, especially as it relates to, for instance, SaaS, because it's something that I've looked into personally. I'm happy to discuss, but that's just, if you're interested. It's not something that I feel like putting in this class and potentially testing you guys on. There's also exclusivity arrangements, right? An exclusivity arrangement, if it's with a customer, means the customer can't leave you, right? But also, if your product is useful only for customers that use another product, and you get an exclusivity arrangement with that other product saying that they can only allow you to work with their product in that way, that can create a barrier to competition as well. Now, the problem with that is if someone tells me that they're going to create a barrier to competition by entering into exclusive partnerships with Samsung and like Apple, like my reaction is going to be, that sounds awesome. Come back to me when that's happened. Because it's actually very difficult to secure those exclusivity arrangements with large companies. Dropbox tried it and they gave up quickly, right? So exclusivity arrangements, it's like, if it hasn't been done yet, I'm not buying it. Just my view. Branding is also a manufactured barrier that might be, one manifestation, Kanishk, as you were saying, of a advantage of being first to enter. I'm not a marketing branding person, so I don't really have much to say about how you do that very well. But, if that interests you, I think probably Dizoted teaches some stuff, just not in the finance department. Sound good? Okie dokie. I also have some discussion about nuances in network effects and marketplace effects, strategies for building network effects. I actually think these slides are written in a fair amount of detail. So I'm not going to talk about them here, but read them. In fact, I am requiring you to read them because I may ask you a question, but it would be a question that's closely linked to exactly what's written. Here's another thing that we can do is I'm asking you to read it. If you guys read it and are like, this is nonsensical, I don't think it's nonsensical, but I wrote it already knowing it, which makes me a difficult judge on that. If you think it's not sufficiently well explained, two things you can do. One is, so for instance, with the marketplaces, I've got a report written by Boris Wertz and a Canadian VC fund called Version 1 Ventures. You can skim through that, and it actually talks about, for instance, the marketplace thing in more detail. I've like basically summarized their report here. So you can read that, at least for the marketplace stuff. And if it still doesn't make sense, yeah, come ask me, and then maybe I'll post an extra short video where I talk about it in a little bit more detail. Does that seem fair to you guys? Anyway, you're allowed to say it doesn't seem fair because I want to do what's good for you. You're my customer, right? So, and the problem is that I just don't know you well enough, especially those of you that I only see a gray box and written names. Anywho, stumbling blocks. I'm not going to talk about this either here. I mean, these are just concrete examples, I think. But I already touched on these in our first topic because I talked about like legal stuff like Zenefits versus Uber, right? And I talked, I think, about Amazon, where Amazon was taking advantage of tax loopholes. And a stumbling block for Amazon early on would have been, well, what if the tax loophole gets closed in the next 2 years? Right? So I discuss a little bit those stumbling blocks around examples that we already discussed in class. Sound good? All right. Even more discussion of examples. You know, they're pretty easy to read. Prosper and Lending Club is an interesting fintech stumbling block story. So again, recommend you just kind of read through it. I don't think I add much value just reading the slide. Okay.